Добрий вечір. Сьогодні у нас особливий випуск. Навіть не знаю, якої рубрики, тому що їх декілька у нас, і переважно ми говоримо про англійський футбол у цих рубриках. Є, звісно, інші. І гість сьогоднішній, зокрема, вже був співрозмовником у інших темах, зокрема у темі про південноамериканський футбол. Але сьогодні мені б хотілося з ним поговорити про дещо інше, поговорити з ним про його життя у Англії. Уругвайський журналіст Карлос для мене особисто є одним із прикладів у цій професії. Так буває, ти зустрічаєшся з різними іноземними колегами, і хтось залишає справді серйозне враження. Карлос один з таких журналістів, і тому зараз я його додам, і ми почнемо нашу сьогоднішню розмову. Carlos, ¿qué tal? Bienvenido. Hoy tenemos que hacerlo en inglés.
Perfecto. Dimitro, es un auténtico placer, pero en inglés o en español, como quieras.
We have to switch to English because it's about English football and because we're going to talk about your Fulem and your life in England. So welcome once again to the channel. I know the story, but I want you to tell those who will listen to this and who are watching now, how did you end up in England, first of all? And then we'll move on to Fulham Football Club.
Okay. First of all, Dimitro, it's a pleasure to be here with you, a very good friend of mine. And it's a pleasure also to be doing this video for a Ukrainian public. It's an enormous pleasure for me today. So the story is very simple. We were living in Uruguay, my family, and my father got a job offer from the BBC in 1967. And he decided to go there first in order to arrange for the schooling of my sister and myself, to find an adequate flat for us, which he did just around the corner from the FA, the Football Association, in Lancaster Gate. And in March of 1968, the rest of the family, my mother, my sister, and myself, we moved to London. And that's how the story began. My schooling took place there, and I lived in London until I was 24. So the formative years, the most important years in one's life, I spent in London.
And the second question is, why Fulham?
I said that my father went to London a few months before us in order to make all the necessary arrangements. And of course, being a football supporter, he went to most of the London grounds to watch football on Saturday afternoons. He went to Chelsea, Tottenham, Arsenal, and Fulham. He didn't go as far east as West Ham, didn't go to Queen's Park Rangers. But when the rest of the family arrived and my father wanted me to go to a football match, he wanted to take me to a football match, there were several considerations. One was the safety, because Chelsea, Tottenham, and Arsenal in those days, with a bit of hooliganism, it wasn't completely safe for an 8-year-old boy. And there was a second reason, which was that my father felt very sorry for Fulham, because they had been relegated from the first division to the second division, and the following season from the second division to the third division. So my first match at Fulham was in the third division against Bradford City, a 0-0 draw. The third reason why my father chose Fulham was that with the ground, Craven Cottage, being next to the Thames, next to the river, it reminded him of his team in Uruguay, Rampla Juniors, which is next to the bay, next to the Rio de la Plata. So having the water opposite where you sit was something reminiscent for him of Rampla Juniors. So for those three reasons, we ended up going to Craven Cottage. And we suffered a lot, I must say. More suffering than enjoyment, but I wouldn't change it for the world.
Because, yeah, you think about it, your first game, third division, 0-0 draw, all the ingredients of a beautiful game. And then you still returned, and you were returning afterwards. So what was it like when you were at school there in England, in London? How many other Fulham supporters did you actually meet during your school days?
One. And for the first few months at school, I didn't even know him because he was 2 years older than myself. And I remember that I was in the first year in secondary school, and he was in the third year, and the bigger boys were playing football. And in goal, there was this very large Greek boy who had a black and white scarf. And you can imagine that I was not expecting another Fulham supporter. So I went up to him, and my question was, do you support Newcastle? And he said, no, Fulham. And from that moment on, we've been friends until today. He's living in Cyprus now, and we're still friends. We're still in touch. We still talk about Fulham. And the thing was that in those years, Queen's Park Rangers were doing very well. And most of the school, obviously, schoolboys were Chelsea supporters, Arsenal supporters, Tottenham, Manchester United supporters, Liverpool supporters. But what irritated me the most was that there were so many Queen's Park Rangers supporters who really are a smaller, or have always been a smaller club than Fulham. But in those years, they would beat us so easily. And they had a magnificent side, I must say. I mean, they nearly won the league. And that was very depressing for a Fulham supporter who felt very lonely at school.
But when you mention those Man United supporters, Liverpool supporters, glory hunting existed back in the 1960s and 70s.
Let me tell you something, Dimitro. In the late 70s at school, there were Nottingham Forest supporters. Where did they come from? So obviously in London, you would not expect to have Nottingham Forest supporters. And there weren't any until Nottingham Forest won the league and then won the 2 European Cups. So yes, glory hunters all the time. You always find them. You found them then, and you find them now.
But back at the Craven Cottage, what kind of public went to the stadium back in the 60s and the 70s? Were local people who lived in the area, or others who just accepted, like your family, of your father and yourself, accepted Fulham as their club? What was it like at the stadium during the games?
It was mainly local people from the area. If you didn't live in the area and grow up with Fulham, there was no reason to support Fulham. For viewers who might not know, Fulham have naturally been a second division club. They have had moments in the in the first division, but whenever they've been in the first division, it's been a fight against relegation, always. The highest finish until the last time we had a longer stretch in the Premier League, the highest ever finish for Fulham was 10th in the first division. But usually it was a fight against relegation, and Fulham were famous for miraculous survivals. When they looked doomed, they looked like they were going to be relegated for sure, they would somehow win a couple of matches at the end, be safe. So they were known as the Houdini Club, Harry Houdini. So there was no reason to support a team like that. I always say that Murphy's Law was invented to describe Fulham's fortune. If anything can go wrong at Fulham, it will go wrong. And yes, there used to be about 8,000 people at Craven Cottage for a third division match, which wasn't bad. But what I do remember as a small boy, my living memory, is of a very quiet ground. Very, very quiet. People would be watching the game in silence. You don't associate silence with English football grounds. But Fulham supporters are different. And I remember that occasionally somebody, by inspiration or by mistake, would do something good, something useful for Fulham. And you would hear just moderate applause like it was a cricket match. And that was it. But it was a beautiful scenery, because you would have the pitch and you would have opposite. We were sitting in the Stevenage Road stand, which is now the Johnny Haynes stand, the old wooden one, wooden seats and brick outside. To the left, we have the cottage. So it's opposite where the cameras are today. And opposite that, we had an open stand, which was probably about 10 steps high, no more. So you could see the river. You could see the river. And people used to say when the game got too boring, which was very often, you would just look at the boats going by.
Because 3 years ago, when Dynamo Kiev played Chelsea, I went to London and I decided, okay, I have to go and see Craven Cottage, even though, of course, there was no game. And just on the approach, you go through the park and you just feel, God, this is so good. I mean, the atmosphere that might have been generated there by all those fans, even back in the day, you could almost feel it. It's like any London ground, I can tell you, because I went to a few, and even Stamford Bridge. It is a proper football ground, no matter what happened to the club. It's a proper football ground. And the same with the Craven Cottage. The houses around the stadium, when you walk towards it, you almost imagine yourself paying at the turnstile, the way it used to be, without all those tickets that you've got today, like even electronic tickets or whatever. It's like probably the most historical ground I've ever seen in England, or in London at least.
Yes, it has that beautiful brick facade, and the doors into the turnstiles are very narrow, very, very narrow. I wonder how my big Greek friend Dimitrios could get in through the doors, because he's a very big man. And yes, as you approach, if you approach the ground from the Bishop's Park end, which is a beautiful walk towards the ground, you can go from Putney or you can go from Hammersmith. And the beautiful walk is from Putney. Hammersmith is just buildings. But the streets next to the ground are very well kept, very nice houses. The whole social class changed around Craven Cottage and in the Fulham and Hammersmith area, because Fulham, in fact, is in Hammersmith. It's Fulham and Hammersmith is now the borough, but Fulham is in the Hammersmith district, and Chelsea is in the Fulham district. Chelsea is not in Chelsea, as you well know, but I'm just saying this for the viewers. Chelsea is further towards the center of town with regards to where Fulham is. And the train station, the underground station for Stamford Bridge is Fulham Broadway. But anyway, those houses and the people living there were not well off. They were not rich people. But those houses, because they're very big, the prices shot up. And some of those houses were worth, a few years ago, were worth £1 million. So now Fulham is regarded as an upper class area, whereas that was not the case when I started going.
So you were a season supporter by the time Fulham suddenly got to the FA Cup final in 1975. What was that season like? Because we'll talk about, of course, the divisions and promotions and relegations, but that particular season when your team went to an FA Cup final.
It was something you could not imagine. Fulham had been to, I believe, 4 FA Cup semi-finals before, and lost every one. But always, sporadic appearances, with many years between those appearances. It was something that, as a small boy, supporting a 3rd division team, which I saw get promoted to the 2nd division. I saw 2 seasons in the 3rd division, and then they were promoted, and then they were struggling not to get relegated back to the 3rd division. So the last thing I could imagine, I would watch FA Cup finals, Arsenal-Liverpool 1971. I went to the Chelsea-Leeds final in 1970. 1972, Leeds-Arsenal. 1973, Leeds Sunderland. 1974, Liverpool Newcastle. The FA Cup was very big then. It was the occasion, the FA Cup final. The television companies, the two main ones, BBC and ITV, would have programs which started at 9 o'clock in the morning and lasted all day, and it was all about the FA Cup final. So it was the biggest thing. The league was important, obviously, but the magic that the FA Cup had, nothing else could compare. So to imagine Fulham getting to Wembley was just an impossible dream, in the same way as I used to dream about playing in Europe. And it was such a distant hope, but then it happened. So I can say that I've fulfilled both my dreams as a Fulham supporter. And that season, this is something else which is interesting. As I said, Murphy's Law was invented for Fulham. Do you know the team that has needed the most number of matches, the highest number of matches to get to an FA Cup final was Fulham. I think it was 11 matches. With Hull in the third round, we had 2 replays, so that's 3 matches. Nottingham Forest in the fourth round, we had 3 replays, that's 4 matches. Then the fifth round, that's 7 matches already. The fifth round was a win away to Carlisle, who were in the first division then. So that's 8 matches. Then we beat the league leaders, Everton. We beat the league leaders as a second division club. We beat them at Goodison Park, 2-1. That's 9 matches. And then, of course, the semi-final was with a replay, Birmingham City, who are again a first division club. So that's 11 matches to get to the FA Cup final. We did it the hard way. There's no other way Fulham can do things, suffering. And the victory, the goal that John Mitchell scored in the semi-final against Birmingham in the replay was in the last second of injury time. So again, it was suffering right until the end. And by the way, the team that has needed the most number of matches to get to a Europa League final, guess who? It was Fulham, yes, because they had to play preliminary rounds as well. So it's a recurring thing. Whenever Fulham have the slightest bit of success, they do it the hard way.
It was also a very special cup final in 75 because you played West Ham and you had Bobby Mur as a Fulham player.
Yeah. Also, there had only ever been one All-London or Cockney Cup final. Only one, 1967, Chelsea-Tottenham. That was the only one. So it was a second London final, which made it very special. But of course, Bobby Mur had arrived. He was a veteran by that time. And West Ham no longer needed him. So Allan Mallері, who had been playing for Fulham, Allan Mallері started at Fulham, went to Tottenham, where he was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. I always say that playing with Allan Mallері in midfield was like playing with 12 players because he was such a hard worker. And then at the end of his career, he went to Fulham again in the second division, and he saved us practically on his own from relegation, from the second to the third. We were bottom when he arrived. And he did so much. He was such a quality player and such a hardworking player that practically on his own, he saved Fulham, and we finished 1 spot above relegation. So Allan Mallері, being a friend of Bobby Mur, convinced him to go and play for Fulham. And as luck would have it, Bobby Mur had to face his until then one and only club, the club that he grew up playing for. And had to play the FA Cup final against West Ham. So both Mallері and Mur played that FA Cup final. 2 England internationals in the veteran stage of their careers. Fulham lost, of course. They've never won a title if you don't include, second division, third division. If you don't include that, we won the Intertoto. But at the end of the match, Mallері and Mur in the dressing room, they stood on a table, the massage table. Where players get their massages. They stood up and they said thank you to all the other players for bringing 2 old men back to Wembley.
What are your memories of that particular day? Do you have something that still is there with you about that game?
It was, you know what it's like when you're so excited that everything goes very quickly and in a blur. What I do remember was waking up in the morning and thinking, today I'm going to see Fulham play at Wembley. And my father made a very big effort to get the tickets because it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. And he surprised me with the tickets a few days before. But to wake up that morning and to know, to be aware that my team, my small team, my modest team, who I would watch playing Barnsley, Doncaster, Halifax, these were the teams that we were playing, would be playing the FA Cup final. And that day, the focus would be on Fulham and West Ham, but also on Fulham. So it was amazing. And then I remember that Fulham played very well. But typical Fulham they've always been a good footballing team, but they've not been typically English in the sense that they've not been good for a fight, usually. Back in those days, anyway. It was nice football, but if any team matched them for quality, but also got stuck in, then Fulham would lose. And most English teams got stuck in, if not all, except for one, 91 out of 92. And I remember Fulham had chances. We had two wingers, Jimmy Conway and Les Barrett, who in the third division, I saw them as younger players, and they were very quick. They would dribble beautifully. They were dangerous. But by 1975, they were getting on a bit. So they were not the same players they were. But it was exciting to watch them. And I do remember our goalkeeper, Peter Mellor, who was a very good goalkeeper, who never let Fulham down. But I'm afraid that he made a couple of mistakes. Alan Taylor, who had signed for West Ham from Rochdale not long before. I think he got the 2 goals that won the semi-final, and then he got the 2 goals in the final. So as a 13-year-old boy, what I do remember is leaving Wembley Stadium in tears.
Yeah, that's the kind of experience we all had, I think, leaving the stadium in tears and stuff like that. Did you go to any away games in the 70s or 80s?
A few. But I remember one occasion when we went away to Preston, which is as far as you can go in England, 220 miles. And in those days, we didn't have sat-navs, we didn't have navigators. And we got lost a couple of times, my father and myself. And we arrived there, and Fulham were playing in a blue shirt, white shorts, and blue socks. And we can't wear Chelsea's colours. We cannot wear Chelsea's colours. They're our rivals. How can we wear blue? But anyway, by the way, we also wore blue in the Europa Cup final. So we got there, and we got there late. We got nearly half an hour late. And in the 15 minutes until half time, Preston scored. And then in the first 15 minutes of the second half, Preston scored again. And my father said, "Do you know something?" We were playing terrible. We were awful, as usual. And my father said to me, "Look, it's a long way back." He said, what's the point of staying here any longer with what we're seeing this, we know how it's going to go. And we left early. So basically we stayed there for under an hour after such a long trip. And on the way back, of course, we got lost in Spaghetti Junction in Birmingham. We spent hours trying to get back. So it wasn't a great experience, but these experiences that turn out badly for all the wrong reasons, everything goes wrong. In the end, you have a good memory of the day.
No, that's true, because a lot of my memories about away trips are mostly about the trips, because the results were what they were for the club, for the national team, and you'd be very upset after the game. But then later you would think about it. You would think about the places you visited and people you were with, and it makes it easier, of course. But it's still
time helps. Time helps, and you remember those moments very fondly. And it's always nice to travel away because, as you said, you meet people who share your passion. And of course you want to win. And of course, traveling back home a long way when things have gone wrong is not nice. But it's an experience that can happen. You know it can happen. If you support a team like Fulham, it will probably happen. But you still do it. And, the following week or the following game that you play away, you do it again. So it must mean that there's enjoyment in the suffering.
Because also when you mentioned that you left earlier, I was thinking back to it. And the last time I went earlier was in 1992 when we played Anderlecht in the UEFA Cup. We lost 4-2 away. And it was 3-0 to Anderlecht at home. And we missed the penalty, I think. Or they missed the penalty. Even that. They missed the penalty. So we decided, okay, let's just go. But after that, the only reason I had to go earlier was if I had work to do. Just remember there was a friendly tournament in memory of Lobanovsky, and I had to go after the 90 minutes of the final just because I had a game to commentate on. And so, but to go for that particular reason that I was fed up, it was back in the 1992, and then I thought, okay, look, I know it is what it is. It can be very bad, but stay until the final whistle. It's just like something that you promise yourself and you try to stick to it, even though sometimes you just want to go after the first half.
Of course. On that day, my father was driving back and he made the decision. When I've been to football on my own or with friends, I have never, ever left early because I think I wait for 1 week or 2 weeks or however long it is to watch my football team. And for instance, when I went to Craven Cottage, and even if we were losing, it feels like home and you like being there. And as I said, there is a form of enjoyment in the suffering as well, because it's part of your team and it's part of your identity to be bad and to be losers. So I wouldn't leave early. I've had friends as well who I've been with, and they've left the game 10 minutes early, but I've stayed behind and then I've met up with them. But we don't spend that much time watching our teams live. Because they play at home every 2 weeks, and sometimes for different reasons you can't go. So when you're there, I think you should be there as long as possible.
You mentioned earlier the issue of hooliganism. And did you have to face the hooliganism, let's say in the 70s, even in London? Because when you go from one ground to another in London, it might be difficult.
Yes, there were some occasions. I remember going to Stamford Bridge with a friend of mine, and we sat next to a Chelsea supporter who in those days might have been typical of the Chelsea supporters. He didn't have a neck. He was, and he looked like he was ready for trouble. But we were sitting that day. In those days, you could stand, of course. On that day, I don't know why we were sitting, but my friend thought of a very quick way of befriending this Chelsea supporter and avoiding any kind of trouble by offering him a cigarette. and he accepted. And they exchanged a few words. And my friend spent all game giving him cigarettes just to keep him happy. And I remember before the game started, my friend said to him, "You don't mind if we cheer Fulem on, do you?" So he was preparing the ground for us to celebrate in case we scored. But of course we didn't. We lost, as we always do at Stamford Bridge. We lost 2-0. And then there was another occasion when Fulham nearly got promoted to the first division. That was another thing that I was hopeful of seeing. Fulham in the top division. It was the FA Cup final, Fulham in the first division, and Fulham in Europe. And the season that Malcolm MacDonald coached Fulham played beautiful football. And at the beginning of the season, we were beating teams handsomely. We were winning. We beat Newcastle 4-1 away. We beat Wolves, I think 4-0 or something like that at Molineux. But then typically in the month of March, Fulham hit relegation form. We started losing every week. And it all started with Leicester coming to Craven Cottage. And Leicester were fourth, Fulham were third. 3 got promoted. And Lineker was playing for Leicester City with Alan Smith. And Leicester were doing the opposite to Fulham. Fulham started to lose, Leicester started to win. I think there was an 11-point gap between the two. In those days, I think it was still 2 points. So the gap was bigger. And it was getting smaller and smaller. So when Leicester came, we thought, okay, we beat them, and that's it. They beat us 2-0, of course. I mean, this is Fulham all over. So we continued going to all of these matches until the end of the season, hoping that we would pick up a point somewhere, but we didn't. We went to Hillsborough to watch us play Sheffield Wednesday, and it was a tight game. But of course, Mick Lyons, who was a very dirty central defender who had played for Everton, scored the winner, 1-0. And leaving Hillsborough, there were 4 of us, 4 Fulham supporters. We went together in one car. And on the way out, we were ambushed and attacked by Sheffield Wednesday supporters. And the police were looking the other way. They didn't care. They didn't care because we were the Londoners. And the Sheffield Wednesday supporters were the locals. So they did nothing. Somehow we managed to avoid serious damage. But yes, it was quite a worrying moment.
Just recently, I heard about another example of how people in the north and in Yorkshire as well treat Londoners. And we're talking about 2022. The Harry Pearson, the writer, who's on the When Saturday Comes podcast, was talking about his visit to one of the non-league grounds in the northeast of England. And after the game, he went to a chip shop, maybe just usual to have some fish and chips or whatever. And his friend asked the guy there, "Do you have anything for my son? He's a vegetarian." So that guy just looked at him and said, "Go back to London."
Of course,
2022, yeah. And you're talking about 82-83.
Yeah.
When Leicester finished on 70 points and Fulham on 69.
Yeah. And
Fulham were denied promotion by, well, virtually a point, or that game that you lost.
Well, there was a final game away to Derby County at the baseball ground, and we needed to get a result. And again, we lost, of course. But, and this again is typical of Fulham, the Derby supporters invaded the pitch, and the police struggled to get the supporters off the pitch. And when they managed to get the supporters off, they didn't go back into the stands. They stood next to the pitch. They were standing next to the touchline. So when the Fulham supporters, the Fulham players would run with the ball, you would get Derby supporters coming on and kicking the Fulham players. I mean, how the game was allowed to continue in those conditions, I don't know. But the fact is that after the match, which we lost, and it meant we did not get promoted, Fulham went to the High Court and said this match either has to be replayed or we should be given the points. In Italy, just a couple of weeks before, something similar had happened, and the league had given the team that were the victims then the victory, and Fulham used that as an example. But of course, the High Court said, Fulham, Sorry. So the result stood, and then we also got pelted with coins as supporters from the stand, and it was terrible. Derby was not a nice experience either.
You mentioned Bobby Moore as a Fulham player, but you also saw someone even more iconic in a Fulham shirt. And we're talking here about George Best. I know for you, he's one of the greatest of all time, fifth for you, after the usual top four that we have in game.
What I would say about George Best is, and people I don't think realize this, he was nearly as good as the top players that you mentioned, the top four, with the ball. He was pure magic, like Maradona might be. But there was something else to George Best, which the other four did not have. And that is that George Best was the best forward by a mile in any match. He was the best midfielder, and he was the best defender. Because his tackling, and it was said by players in that era, they said he could tackle like the hardest fullback. And he did. His heading was supreme, not just to score goals, but to win the ball in the center circle or in midfield. He could jump 5'8", which is a meter 72. And he would win headers. He had guts. He did not want to lose. He would fight, chase. He's the most complete player I have ever seen. And if I was asked which player of all the players in history would I want in my team, I might say George Best ahead of everyone else, because George Best was the best at everything, whereas all the others were magical with the ball usually, but some other aspects of the game, they were not, not quite as good. They were nowhere near as good as George Best. And I'm going to show you a picture. I got this program. It's from a FA Cup game against Swindon, because in the cover we have George Best and Rodney Marsh, another fabulous player. George Best and Rodney Marsh. That season was tremendous. And Rodney Marsh was actually a Brazilian, I think, born in Sid Cup, because he played like a Brazilian. And as I said, George Best was supreme, incomparable. George Best at his peak, I think, had no equal.
Yeah, and you just wonder, where did it all go wrong? But actually, Rodney Marsh was the next player I wanted to ask you about. Because again, you think about Fulham, second division, third division back then. Who would play for them? But then you start looking up the names, and you're just like, blimey, Rodney Marsh was also a Fulham player.
And he started at Fulham. It's not just that he happened to play for Fulham. He started at Fulham, then he went to Queen's Park Rangers, where he became an idol. He went to Manchester City, and then he went back to Fulham. Played in the US, as well as George Best. But he was different to Best in the sense that he liked having the ball, and he only played when he had the ball. Whereas George Best, yes, he loved having that. When George Best had the ball, it would be difficult to see him pass it because he liked to dribble past play. But when he did pass it, I always say that George Best was like Messi in the final third. He was like Xavi in midfield, but he was also Gattuso in midfield. You see, so if you combine that, what a player do you have? But Rodney Marsh was magical. He scored a fabulous goal against Hereford, a curling goal, similar to a goal that Mitrovic scored recently, a curling ball into the top corner. That iconic match against Hereford that you can find everywhere on YouTube. I was there. It was a fabulous game. And in fact, here it is, the program for that game, Fulham versus Hereford. That is that game that Fulham won 4-1, and where George Best and Rodney Marsh were tackling each other, and they were having fun, and everyone was laughing, and 18,000 people an 18,000 crowd were present at Craven Cottage, which in those days for Fulham was incredible. I'll tell you a story about George Best's debut. He played his first game for Fulham against Bristol Rovers. The previous season, when Fulham played Bristol Rovers, there were 6,000 people in Craven Cottage. We had an attendance of 6,000. When George Best played for Fulham against Bristol Rovers, the following season, 21,000 people, just because of George Best. Absolutely.
And he played 42 games for Fulham, just one
49.
season. Then he 49.
49 in all.
Then he went to the US. But one season can be so memorable when we're talking about someone like George Best, when we talk about a player like Rodney Marsh. Generally, in England, in the 70s, there were a few players, Stan Bowles, Rodney Marsh, who were mavericks on the pitch, but who would hardly ever get a call up to an England national team. Did you have any special feelings about English national team, or was it just Uruguay all the way and you didn't really care? And how did you see that particular side in the 70s? Because when Alf Ramsey left, you had all this Don Revie situation, and then Ron Greenwood became a manager. So what was happening there with the national team? Did it reflect, in a way, how England was at the time? Why all those players, maverick players, were looked upon as with a kind of a frown? Just, these guys are not even English, Just like...
As you know, Dimitro, because you know the English game in and out, those players in that time were described as a luxury. Now, in any other language and in any other country, if you said a player was a luxury, it would be something positive. You would be praising the player. What they meant in England when they said a player such as Rodney Marsh was a luxury was a luxury we cannot afford. We shouldn't have this player in our team because there are so many things he doesn't do. But it makes me laugh when I see now people saying that England has such a wealth of talent. And they make us believe, or they want to make us believe, the media, the people within football, that this is the richest generation England has ever had. Everyone except for Harry Kane would not get into the England team of the 1970s. They wouldn't get in. And as you said, some of these brilliant performers, such as Frank Worthington, Alan Hudson, Tony Curry, Stan Bowles, Rodney Marsh, Duncan McKenzie, a bit later, Ґленн Ходдл. The talent, I actually believe that no other country in Europe had so much talent available to it as England did in the 70s, and yet England didn't want to use them. So, as you pointed out, these players hardly played for England. All of these players we mentioned didn't get too many caps. I think Rodney Marsh got 9 or something like that. So it was a bit of a waste of talent, which England never knew how to use, because there was still, I think, the effect of the Alf Ramsey team. Now, Alf Ramsey had brilliant players such as Bobby Charlton, possibly the best English player of all time. I always say that Tom Finney was the greatest English player of all time, but Bobby Charlton is certainly up there, and he's one of the greatest in the world. But Ramsey wanted a team of runners. He got rid of the wingers, as you know. And then in 1970, England probably had a better team than 1966. But again, I think he put too much emphasis on work rate rather than quality. And that mentality, I think, damaged English football, because English football could have combined quality with work rate. And my God, had England done that in the 1974 World Cup, for instance, who knows how far they would have gone. But certainly, if you're talking about talent, natural talent, that was what these players had in the 70s. They didn't need academies. What was a coach going to teach them? What could a coach teach Frank Worthington? Absolutely nothing. The players that you have today are fabricated. They're good players, very good players. And I'm sure that they have been born with a talent for this. But they're not like the Mavericks. They're not as good.
Yeah, instead in 74, England didn't even play in the World Cup. They missed the Final Four of European Championship in 76 as well. So it was a very strange period because the World Cup win on the home soil was just a few years away. And you would think that, yeah, England had everything to build on it, but they just simply didn't. So it rolled on to the 80s, and it was the same thing maybe, because you mentioned Γκленν Ходдл. Someone said about Γκленν Ходdl because he played in France. If he was French, he'd have 100 caps.
Mm.
And we're talking about the period when it was very difficult to get to 100 caps. You'd have to be in the side for a long time. Now you can, of course, do it in a few seasons, maybe.
Yeah.
Especially with those Sven-Göran Eriksson substitutions that he loved so much.
But as I know, Dimitro, you and I like very similar football. And if you see highlights today of what Γκленν Ходdl used to do, how many players can you think of today who can do what Γκленν Ходdl did? They're not
Just
many.
A few.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure a lot of them would be Europeans.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I would say is that there might be players who have a similar talent, but players who would get the results that Ходdl did because he would make his beautiful football be positive for his team, because he would score goals, he would give assists. He did magnificent things which were not just for show. He wasn't just playing to the gallery. He was actually winning matches with his skill and with his brilliance. And I'm not sure that there is a Γκленν Ходdl anywhere in the world today.
Yeah. But, the other interesting thing is that in the 70s, in the late 70s, we had this emergence of English club football. Liverpool, Forest, Villa, they all won European Cup. 3 different clubs, different managers, different strategies, maybe philosophies as now they're called. But what was so different about that? What happened to the clubs that they became so dominant on the European scene, especially in the European Cup?
I think that on the one hand, the physical aspect. You see, I said before, if England could combine work rate and physique with talent, they would have been a force to be reckoned with. They didn't do it because they didn't want to use the talent they had at their disposal. But football clubs did. Some football clubs. Liverpool, Nottingham Forest, they had talent and they had strength and work rate. So I think they combined the two things, and that's what made them dominant. They were as skillful or more skillful than some of their opponents, but then you couldn't outrun them. And they also had something else which worked to their advantage, which was the speed of the game. If you see Liverpool at the end of the 70s, the ball would be zipping around all over the place very quickly.
Because, it's interesting because when people talk about Liverpool now, I was like, I saw it.
Exactly.
I saw the videos of the Liverpool the 70s and the early 80s. It's more or less the same, and sometimes on a pitch that didn't even look like a football pitch.
Yeah, of course. So it was far more difficult. But there's something else that I would add, and I think you agree with me. We've talked about this in the past. When people say football today is so much quicker than it was before. I don't agree. If you see English League matches from the 70s, the ball would be flying around, people would be running at top speed. Everything happened very, very quickly. I'm not saying that with training, today's training obviously is better than the training of 40, 50 years ago. That's obvious. It happened. All you have to do is watch athletics and world records keep getting beaten. But players today are capable of running quicker than players in the 70s, but that doesn't mean they play quicker. And if you see today's matches, possession games, possession matches, and you see the midfielder passing to the player on the right wing, the player on the right wing passing to the central midfielder, and then the central midfielder passes to his teammate, the other central midfielder. Then it goes to the left wing, and then it comes back. Is that quick? Is that fast football? I often think that what we're watching today is much, much slower than the football we would watch before, because it would be direct. Liverpool in the 70s, people say the passing game. It's true. They had a passing game. But first of all, they got the ball forward as quickly as possible. The game plan was to hit a long ball very quickly to a Liverpool player near the penalty area, and then they would start the passing game very quickly, very quick passes to get behind the defense. Now that's speed. One long ball and then 2 or 3 quick passes, and then you're in on the goal. That's playing at speed, not sideways passing all the time, which for me is often very tedious. I watch top-class football today, what is regarded as the best teams, and I sometimes find it very difficult to not fall asleep because of how they play. Sometimes you think teams might as well play with no goalkeeper. Oh, sorry, the goalkeeper has to play with his feet. That's why they need a goalkeeper. Not because he has to make any saves, because there aren't any shots.
So that was Liverpool in the 70s, but also Nottingham Forest and Brian Clough, the best manager England never had, the national team.
Yeah.
What was that team like? I think it was a bit similar to Liverpool.
Do you know, I saw that team the season they got promoted to the first division, the season before they won the league. They played at Craven Cottage and they drew 2-2 with Fulem. And Nottingham Forest got promoted as the third team. And most of those players were still in the team when they were league champions. And a lot of those players were still in the team when they won the European Cup. Brian Clough didn't need stars because he got them playing well. He would motivate them. He got a player like John Robertson, a fantastic Scottish left winger who was right-footed. But he got him believing in himself. Robertson was a player who had lost his way. His career looked as if it was going downhill. Like with a lot of other Nottingham Forest players who had practically given up on their careers. But Brian Clough made them believe in themselves. And he got them playing attacking football, whoever they played against. People remember Nottingham Forest had a rock-solid defense because they didn't concede any goals. But that didn't mean they were defensive. They were good in defense, but they were very good at attacking, and they would get good goals, and they played excellent football at the City Ground, which was the pitch was just covered in mud. There wasn't a blade of grass on the pitch, and yet they managed to play good football. If you see the semi-final of the European Cup against Cologne, 3-3, you look at the state of the pitch, and yet they still played good football on that pitch. And another story, which I'm sure you know about Brian Clough, which tells you exactly what a motivator he was. After that semi-final against Cologne, 3-3 at the City Ground, the second leg with away goals, nobody thought Nottingham Forest would win. So the players were in the dressing room before the game, waiting for Brian Clough to give them the team talk. And he was nowhere to be seen. He didn't turn up until about 5 minutes before they had to go out to warm up. And all he said was, okay, boys, you've done very well to get this far in the European Cup. You did excellently. Everyone's very proud of you. I'm proud of you. I know there's no way we can beat Cologne. So just go out and enjoy yourselves, and everyone will be very happy that we got this far. And he left the dressing room. And the players looked at each other and said, what does he mean we can't win this? Of course we're going to win it. And they won.
That's exactly what he meant.
Yeah,
That's
exactly
what he wanted from them. But also the managers, we were talking about players, but the 70s and then the 80s, those were the times of some really, really good managers in English football. Not only Clough, we have to mention Liverpool and Bill Shankly and Joe Fagan, but you take any club, Tottenham in the 70s, and Bill Nick and what he did, for example, with Tottenham over the 60s and the 70s. What do you think about that particular group, say, of managers? Because sometimes I think, well, now we know that Jurgen Klopp and Pep Guardiola invented football for English people. We forget a bit about what great managers they had during those years.
Oh, yes. Malcolm Allison, for instance. He was a tactical genius. And people think there were no tactics in the 60s or 70s. As you know, I've done coaching courses, and my teachers would say, no, before there weren't any tactics. These are my teachers saying there were no tactics in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Of course there were tactics. If there weren't any tactics, then Sir Alf Ramsey wouldn't have changed the wingers for midfielders. And he'd go back to Ugo Meisel in the 30s with Austria. And there's always been tactics. There's always been tactical geniuses. Well, Malcolm Allison would study football from other countries as well. And he tried to pick the best from those countries and introduce it into English football. He started looking after players' diets. And the actual training they did was different to what was going on at the time. Bill Nicholson as well. He was he loved good attacking football. He was very good at attracting good players, like he did with Dave Mackay from Hearts. And Dave Mackay was the linchpin. He was central to Tottenham's success, the same way as Danny Blanchflower, Cliff Jones on the left wing. They had a fantastic team. That Tottenham team of the early 60s was the best in England. They did the double in 61. That's the last time they won the league. And they might have been close to being the best team in Europe. They won the Cup Winners' Cup, beating Atletico Madrid 5-1 in the final. And okay, they didn't get the luck they needed in the European Cup when they had the chance, but they didn't have enough attempts at the European Cup because they didn't win the league again after 1961. But yes, there were great managers like Dave Sexton as well, Matt Busby. But I think managers have to know how much they have to do, when they have to intervene and when they don't have to intervene. When Manchester United played Estudiantes for the Intercontinental Cup in Argentina, one of the Argentinian journalists asked Sir Matt Busby, what instructions are you going to give your players before the match? And Matt Busby's answer was, what do you think I can tell Bobby Charlton and George Best and Dennis Law? Now, I think it's shocking that an Argentinian, with all the quality they've had throughout the years, and the players who improvise, and the Mavericks, they've had their own Mavericks, and yet an Argentinian was asking Matt Busby what instructions he would give his players. And Busby gave the perfect answer. He said, what am I going to say? Go out and play.
Well, maybe Argentina knew about the instructions from Juan Carlos Lorenzo that he was preparing for Estudiantes side. So
Exactly.
That might have been different. We mentioned already European Cup. What a glorious tournament it was. For me, growing up in the 80s, it was really the pinnacle, especially when my team were in it, when they won the league and they were participating in it. it was destroyed by European football governing bodies. But even there, of course, Fulham didn't even make it to the first division back then. What did you think of that tournament, of the European Cup of the 70s, of the 80s?
The European nights were magical. And I don't think today's Champions League, definitely not the Europa League, can compare to the atmosphere there was in the stadium. They were electric. And because now football is so global as well, and everyone watches everyone else on TV, for Derby County to play Slovan Bratislava, nobody knew anything about Slovan Bratislava. But then they turned up and they showed they could play football with Ondrus and with Mazni. Fantastic players, Pivarnik. And I think that made it special. The same way as the World Cup was special before, because nobody knew. When you played Tunisia in 1978, you didn't know what was going to happen, and yet they were brilliant. And so in the European Cup, it was the same. And I think the group stages in the Champions League is so tedious and so boring and so unnecessary. Well, it's necessary because it's a money-making objective, isn't it? But from a sporting point of view, I think it should be straight knockout. You lose, you're out. And that's it. And you don't go to another competition because you're out. You're out. That's it. You had your chance. And to put a Champions League team playing in the Europa League is unfair because presumably they're better. So those nights were fantastic. I remember Manchester United. This was, I think, in the Cup Winners' Cup. Manchester United losing 4-0 away to Porto and then winning 5-2 at Old Trafford. Porto qualified, but fantastic nights. The Liverpool Saint-Etienne duels with Fairclough scoring super sub, Batané scoring a fantastic goal from long range. You see, also what made those competitions special, I'm sure you'll agree, is how all of these smaller teams that today are smaller, were as good, if not better, than those teams that today are giants. Now, I've told you this before, and this is for a Ukrainian audience. I love Dynamo. I fell in love with Dynamo in 1975. And since then, I've supported Dynamo in Europe. I've supported Saint-Etienne in Europe, and I've supported Anderlecht in Europe. Why? Because I saw those three teams play beautiful football, beautiful attacking and winning football. And I always say that Dynamo, Anderlecht, and Saint-Etienne are the best teams never to have won the European Cup. You're nostalgic now.
No, because it's very easy to get nostalgic when you think about it, when you talk about it, and when you look at what is called Champions League now. You mentioned Tottenham are playing in it now. They haven't won the league since 1961. They're playing in it now.
They got to the final a few seasons ago. They could have won it.
Yeah, that would have been amazing, actually. When I was thinking about it, now, first of all, they shouldn't have been Ajax. No way, but they did. No. Okay, got to the final. But still, even though after all those years, so 30 years now, since the first ever Champions League, you still think that something is not right. Well, especially when they started allowing third and fourth teams from big leagues, because when they allowed the runners-up, I was thinking, okay, sometimes even in England, I think it was the season when, do you remember Newcastle? Kevin Keegan's Newcastle were very good.
Yes,
we were playing for the title for up until the very last few weeks of the season. So they lost it to Man United, and I was thinking, look, but Newcastle played well. In a way, they can also be called moral champions, whatever it is. So maybe it is okay for them to participate in this competition as well. But of course, it wasn't because someone wanted those moral champions to be there. No, the reasons were purely financial. So that's why they ended up playing that. And another example I have, for me, it stuck with me since childhood. QPR 6, Partizan 2, and then back in Belgrade, it was Partizan 4, QPR 0. It's like, the European competition and the greatness of it all in once. First of all, QPR, they weren't participating that much in European competitions back then, and don't even think about it now. And on the other hand, you have this well-established club from former Yugoslavia, and they lost 6-2 away. They went back home, and they scored the 4 goals they needed to score. It was one of the results, and of course, those remontadas by Real Madrid in the UEFA Cup as well in the 80s. That was the magic you're talking about. Even though we didn't see those games, of course, we didn't get to watch too many of those games. Back in the Soviet Union, we only watched the Soviet sides and not every game as well. When you saw the goals, you read about it, you kind of felt it. Now in Champions League, it's like a supermarket, especially now, this season, when you have a very condensed schedule. You have to run, you have to get something from the shelf, and you just get back home.
Yeah,
you don't
exactly.
have anything else.
But don't you think it was wonderful that teams like Malmo and Bruges could get to the final? I don't want to see the same teams playing in the semi-finals and final every year. I don't want that. I want more varied football. Also, I think what you said about the availability of matches on TV is very important, and that made it more exciting because there wasn't so much football available on TV. So what you saw, it was very valuable to you. Whereas now, you switch, do I watch this one or do I watch the other one? Or you can choose, and you can see every single game if you want. But most of them are not interesting enough. This season, I think the team that might entertain us is Benfica, who unfortunately beat Dinamo, but they have a fantastic team. And when the draw was made, I thought that Benfica would leave either PSG or Juventus out. I think it's going to be Juventus, but I think Benfica will qualify.
Because the thing is, I even said in one of my streams, I didn't watch PSG Juventus. I didn't really feel like watching it, but I said Benfica, Juventus, Benfica. That's a big one. For me, it's a big one. Because I felt that Benfica could do what they did. Especially now, considering how Juventus are playing. So, we're trying, and I think we're trying to find for us some glimpses of those days in the current European competitions, where we're looking at the Conference League evidence. The clubs from this country, from that, the club from Estonia played the group stage, and then they're from Lithuania, something like that. You look at it, but it used to be the norm. These teams had a chance, just like First Division back in the 70s, back in the 80s. Everyone had a chance. Because Liverpool were dominating the league. Okay, they were dominating the league, but you had Southampton as second. QPR, West Brom, Ron Atkinson's West Brom. What a side it was. Then later, Watford with their long balls and stuff. It was brilliant. And then finally, Everton emerged. Such a force. Now you look at Everton, you pity them. They can't even think about it. They can't even compete. And the teams had a chance. So that was a kind of atmosphere. I don't know, because you lived through all this. So, and I just wanted to ask this. Now, when we sit down before the start of the season, how exciting it is going to be. Or is it Man City or is it Liverpool? What was it like? Because your club didn't play in the First Division, but what was it like? The conversations at the playgrounds, at school, and then later when you played football with your teammates, what was it like before the start of the season?
It was always exciting because the football season was starting, and nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody knew, because a team that one season or the previous season had finished second, third, or fourth might find themselves near the bottom the following season. I remember Chelsea being sixth, for instance, when they had a good team. But Chelsea, we must remember, were not a big team. I still say Chelsea are not a big team. They're a rich team and a successful team, but they're not a big team. They're not a big club. They were sixth, sometimes fifth, but then they got relegated. Tottenham Hotspur got relegated. Manchester United got relegated. Manchester City were down to the third division. Wolverhampton Wanderers were down in the fourth division. So that was English football. You didn't know Southampton, who finished second, as you said, they were in the second division as well. Carlisle played in the first division. Other teams I can't remember now, but small teams. York City were in the second division. Where are York now? Nobody knew. Nobody knew. Of course, you knew that Liverpool were going to be challenging. They were going to be challenging, but you didn't know if they were going to finish above West Brom or not. You didn't know if Arsenal were going to put in a good challenge and win the league. You didn't know if, well, Manchester United in the 70s, only in the second half of the 70s, they came back and started doing well under Dave Sexton, playing with two wingers as well, with Steve Coppell and Gordon Hill. But in 73, 74, they were relegated. And that was the beauty, because you did get shock results, what would be considered shock results today. As you said, Everton were a top club. Everton won the league in 1970, I think it was. And they always struggled to beat Liverpool, it's true, even in the 70s. But Everton-Liverpool was an enormous game. An enormous game. People say in Spain, I don't know what it's like where you are or what the feeling is in the Ukraine, but in Spain they say Liverpool, Manchester United, it's the Clásico, it's the biggest game in England. And this is where they're wrong. They say it has always traditionally been the biggest game. No, it hasn't. The media has made it the biggest game now. You could say it's the biggest game because they're the most successful teams, but that's only since the Ferguson era. Because before Ferguson, Everton had more leagues than Manchester United, more league titles than Manchester United. And so they also, I think the English media has tried to build it up because they want to have an equivalent of Real Madrid, Barcelona. That's what they want. And they want to sell it to the public because football is now all about selling the product. But England doesn't have one big game. It never has, because when Manchester United and Arsenal were doing well, that was the big game. When Liverpool and Chelsea were doing well at the same time, that was the big game. And now the big game is Manchester City, Liverpool. So there isn't a big game. But if ever there was a match which was different to the others, perhaps it was Liverpool-Everton.
Yeah, they played each other in the FA Cup final in the 80s. And there was a joke that they should put a sign at the exit of the city saying, the last to leave for Wembley, please turn off the lights.
Yeah.
Because the whole city would go to London for that particular game, for the FA Cup final. And it was a special era, but, well, then the Hazel happened, and then the Hillsborough happened, and there were changes that were probably necessary, of course, but the other change was the advent of the Premier League, a whole new ball game in 1992. And here we are, loving every second of it now. Look, but of course, we mentioned a lot of historical things, but Fulham are doing well now in the Premier League. They started really well. What's going wrong with them? Why are they?
Against all the odds, we're doing well. I only expected us at this stage of the season, after 7 matches, I thought that if we had 1 point, we would be lucky. And we're 6th. One of the key differences to what's been happening in recent seasons is that now Marco Silva is choosing the players that arrive at Fulham. He is in charge of the signing. I wouldn't say he's in charge, but he tells Tony Khan, the son of the owner, who he wants. Before, Tony Khan, who has no knowledge whatsoever of football, he's involved in some wrestling organization. Now, maybe he knows who the good wrestlers are, but he doesn't know. He wouldn't recognize a good footballer if he fell on his head. And before, it was Tony Khan doing the business. Now Marco Silva, from last season and also in this season, has been in charge, and he's the one who has to work with the players. So it makes sense. That's why I'm not too keen on the idea of a director of football who makes the signings, because It's the manager who is building the team. He knows what he needs and what type of player he needs. You don't always sign the best player in that position. You sign the player who is best suited to your style and to your needs. And only the manager, the coach, knows that. So yes, Marco Silva is doing a fantastic job. And he was instrumental in bringing João Palhinha, who is probably the best defensive midfielder in Europe at the moment, because of what he's doing, his work rate, his tackling. He's putting the most tackles in Europe. And also he comes forward and scores great goals as well. So we're very pleased, very, very pleased. And we didn't expect this.
You mentioned how Brian Clough took the side from the second division to the first division title, then to European Cup. Same players. Nottingham Forest were promoted last season. They signed 21 players. What do you make of that? I'm still trying to get to. I just can't. For God's sake, I just can't understand what it is all about.
As a Fulham supporter, I know what that is, because we did that when we got promoted, and it was a terrible failure. And it's nearly inevitable that policy will fail, because teams need time. And obviously, if you put together a team in such a short space of time, and then you have to face the strongest teams in the country, by the time your team knows the systems and has learned how to play with each other and reaches its peak, maybe it's November, December, if you're lucky. And how many points would you have lost along the way? And then, because you're in a relegation fight and morale is low, maybe the team will not reach the level it could. So I think it's absurd. Throughout history, football clubs have tried to buy success, and it hasn't worked. People will say, yeah, Manchester City and Paris Saint-Germain. What I'm talking about is Manchester City even didn't buy 30 players in one go. They picked the players they needed. Yes, they have the money to do that, and money did bring success there. But they chose the players they needed at any particular time. Remember when Guardiola only signed a right back and a left back? Because that's what he needed then. But to try to, and many teams, as I said, have done this in the past, they have tried to just go mad, bringing players they consider to be good, put them together, and hope for the best. That doesn't work.
We've got a question here for you. What would be a wonder story for you in terms of a surprise title winner this or upcoming season? Tottenham, Wolves, Fulham?
Well, Fulham would be a huge surprise, because we've never won anything. Wolves would be beautiful, because in the 1950s, Wolves were the biggest club in Europe.
Yeah.
In the first half of the 50s, Wolves beat Honved, who were magnificent. They were
proclaimed themselves champions of the world.
Yes. And they beat Real Madrid. They beat every top team. Spartak Moscow, I think they also beat, who were a strong team in those years.
Everybody beats those, it's just like.
So yes, Wolves had a fantastic team. If the European Cup had started a few years before, Wolves would probably have been champions. Tottenham, I would like Tottenham because I would like Tottenham to win, because I like Antonio Conte, even though he's not an attractive coach, but I admire what he does with the resources. I always look at some of the matches that he played with Italy, with ordinary players, and he that match in which they beat Spain 2-0, I thought it was brilliant.
Absolutely brilliant
match. Yeah. Yes. So I like Antonio Conte for that reason. Then they have Harry Kane, who I think is a fabulous player. They got my compatriot Betancourt, who is growing and playing better with every game. Yeah, I think Tottenham would be a good surprise. But I tell you something else that would be a huge surprise, and it might happen within a few years, and that's Newcastle.
Well, because of the
Yeah,
situation now,
yeah,
of course, they'll be signing more and more players and all
yeah.
that. But
If
again,
they do it with their head, then they might achieve it.
well, right?
Let me just tell you a very quick story. Flavio Costa, who was manager of Brazil, in
Mhm.
um, he was interviewed by my father once, and I can't remember what team they were talking about that had spent a lot of money and tried to build a team, and my father said yes. He said with money and with a good head, you might be able to do something. And Flavio Costa said no, not with money and a good head, with a good head and money.
Yeah, that's a very important order, of course, because
Yeah,
it seems like that's what they're trying to do at Man City, for example. Not in Paris for me,
no, that's right.
but
Paris, they just sign names. This season has been different. I think this season they've tried to change the policy, but before it was just if you're a forward with a big name and you earn a lot of money, we're going to make you an offer.
but really, would you consider Fulham right now? Of course, it's only 7 games into the season and stuff. Would you want them to be a contender for a European place this season, so you can go to European games once again?
Yes, of course, I would love it. I don't expect it. I still think that we will be in a relegation fight. We've got some games now coming up where we can pick up points. We're playing Newcastle, we're playing Aston Villa, we're playing I can't remember the other teams, but Bournemouth, I think. Yes, we can pick up points now, but it's a very long season. Just because you've done well now doesn't mean that you're going to continue doing well. Our squad is not that big. We have one goal scorer. It's true that now the goals are being shared out. The other day we beat Nottingham Forest 3-2 and Mitrovic didn't score. But it's going to be difficult. It's going to be tough. And if we finish 17th, 16th, I'll be happy.
That's what supporting a club like Fulham does to you.
Exactly. Yeah.
15th and 16th. No, but also all those decades, 70s and 80s, taught us that in English football, you can at least have that hope. And sometimes Leicester proved it. Miracles do happen. Not as often as we would like them to happen, but still.
Yeah.
Carlos, thanks so much for this. I've taken up a lot of your time, and I really appreciate that. It was great. I really appreciate it, and I do hope that those who listened live enjoyed it, and those who will watch it also enjoy it. So, thank you very much, and I hope to see you again to talk about English football, but also about Uruguay, because we've got the World Cup, this crazy bought by bribes World Cup in less than 2 months. But there is a lot of football to talk about, but it's always good to talk about something that was so good back in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah. Well, it's been my pleasure, Dimitro. You know that I love talking to you about football and other subjects as well. You're a very good friend, and as I said, it's a huge pleasure spending this time talking about football with you. And I would just like to say my very best wishes, and I hope everything can get back to normal in Ukraine, and my best wishes for the Ukrainian people who are facing such a difficult time. I know that lots of Ukrainians will be watching, and I wanted to pass on this message.
Thank you. Ну що ж, я справді дуже вдячний Карлосу за те, що він приєднався сьогодні, міг поговорити з нами. Сподіваюся, що вам було цікаво, і сподіваюся на нові зустрічі з ним. Ну, а зараз ми будемо прощатися. Дуже всім вдячний і на все добре.